That morning, I was already tired, but the noise of the engine made me alert immediately. I looked out the window and saw the silhouette standing next to the gate, as if it were evaluating each movement of the padlock. What scared me the most was his calmness, as if he had all the time in the world to enter. When I turned on the outside lights, I expected him to get scared and run away, but no. The man just walked away slowly, walking backwards without taking his eyes off the house. The silence that remained after he disappeared in the dark was even more disturbing than the sound of the motorcycle coming. I waited a few minutes, trying to convince myself that I was just a lost stranger. But when I looked out the window again, I saw the gate padlock swinging, as if it had been really forced. The detail that froze me was that the latch was slightly crooked, as if someone had tested its resistance. I spent the rest of the night awake, attentive to any noise. Every snack of the house sounded like a warning. Deep down, the worst feeling was not having seen that man trying to get in, but not knowing if he was really alone, or if he was still hiding in some dark point on the ground watching. The next day, I went to check the gates more calmly. The marks were there, metallic scratches right in the area of the lock, as if someone had actually used some tool to try to open. I tried to convince myself that it was just random vandalism, but I couldn't ignore the fact that everything happened at 2 a.m, in absolute silence, and the man showed no surprise when he was caught. That night, before going to sleep, I put a chair leaning against the front door and left the outside lights on. The engine of any car or motorcycle made me freeze with nervousness. I don't know if the guy would come back, but the simple thought that someone can stop in front of my house, in the middle of the night, just to test my limits, was enough to take away my peace. A few days later, the sound returned, this time more distant, as if the motorcycle had stopped across the street. I was silent in the dark, trying to hear any movement. Suddenly, the metallic snap of the gate echoed again. I ran to the window, but I only saw the figure of the same man slowly retreating, staring at the house before disappearing into the curve. That made me panic. It wasn't a coincidence. He didn't say anything, didn't run, just showed up, tried to open the gate and disappeared. I started to wonder if I had already observed the house during the day, if I knew my routine, or if I even knew that I was alone inside. Every noise from the street turned into a silent warning that he could come back at any moment. The next night, I decided not to turn on any lights. I sat in the dark, only with the curtain open enough to observe the gate. Around 2:30 a.m., the muffled snoring of the bike broke the silence again. The man stopped at the same point as before, turned off the engine and stood still, staring at the house as if he knew I was looking. Time didn't seem to pass. He remained there, without moving, for long minutes. My breathing was heavy and my heart raced, but I forced myself not to give any sign that I was home. When he finally turned to leave, I realized that he was not a careless stranger trying to break in at random. It was someone who was studying me, waiting for the right moment. On the third night, I couldn't contain the anxiety, and I sat in the living room with all the lights off. The clock advanced slowly until, shortly after 2 o'clock, the familiar snoring of the motorcycle broke the silence. He was back. This time, he didn't even try to move the padlock. He just turned off the engine, stood still next to the gate and tilted his head, as if he was watching me even in total darkness. My whole body became stiff. I picked up the phone, ready to call the police, but I hesitated, afraid that, noticing any movement inside the house, he would advance. It was endless minutes until, finally, he got on the bike and left slowly, without ever turning his face away from my direction. That night made it clear. It wasn't a coincidence, it was a habit. He came back to watch me, always at the same time, as if he expected something from me. That night, the heart seemed to beat louder than the sound of the wind outside. I sat on the bed, holding my breath, listening to every metallic click of the doorknob being forced. The kitchen was right next to the room, and it was impossible to ignore the proximity of whoever was there. I picked up my cell phone with trembling hands, already typing the police number, but I hesitated when the noise stopped abruptly, as if the person had felt that I was alert. I stood still for a few minutes, with my eyes fixed on the bedroom door, expecting the worst. The sudden silence was even more frightening than the sound of attempts. I felt as if someone was standing in the dark, on the other side of the kitchen door, listening to my movements. After a time that seemed endless, I got up the courage, walked to the kitchen with a knife in my hand, and turned on the lights. Everything was locked as before, but the doorknob was marked, scratched, proof that I hadn't imagined anything. I stayed awake the rest of the night, without the courage to go back to bed. At every little snap of the house, I felt my body tremble, imagining that someone was still outside waiting. When it dawned, I finally had the courage to go out to check the backyard. On the dirt floor next to the door, there were shoe marks, fresh footprints that went to the gate, but did not return. I called the police in the morning and showed the marks, as well as the scratches on the lock. They confirmed that someone had tried to force entry, but said that without cameras or witnesses, it would be difficult to find out who. From that day on, I went to sleep with the balcony lights on and bought a reinforced lock system, but the feeling that that person could try again never left me. That night, even with the locks reinforced, I couldn't sleep. I was lying down, listening to every noise from the street, every car that passed in the distance, every click of the walls of the house. The feeling was that, at any moment, someone would come back to finish what he started. I was too alert, as if my body knew I wasn't safe yet. A few days later, I woke up again in the middle of the night with a strange noise coming from the same direction. They were not attempts to force the door, but slow steps running down the balcony. Dragged walks, going from one side to the other, stopping from time to time, as if the person were listening inside the house. This time, I couldn't even get out of bed. I was still, just praying that the person wouldn't try to get in again. I stood still, listening to that sound of heavy and spaced steps outside. After a few seconds, the noise stopped, but the silence was even more disturbing. It was as if the person was still there, motionless, watching me through the thin walls of the house. I barely breathed, waiting for any sign that indicated that he had left for good. The next morning, I went down to the balcony with my heart racing. The cement floor was marked by footprints of clay-stained boots, right in front of the kitchen door. What terrified me the most was realizing that the marks went to the window of my room, right where I was lying the night before. It was proof that someone had stood there, a few meters from me, while I pretended to sleep. That night, I decided to sleep with the lights on and a kitchen knife next to the bed. Fear didn't let me close my eyes for long. Any pop of the wood or the creaking of the house seemed like a warning that someone was approaching again. I knew I wouldn't be able to spend another whole night just waiting for the worst. The next morning, I called the police and recorded what happened. The officers said they would patrol the region, but made it clear that, without concrete evidence, they could do little. To this day, I don't know who was trying to get into my house that night. I just know that, since then, I've never been able to feel truly safe within my own walls. I was never one to wake up in the middle of the night, but that morning something suddenly made me open my eyes, as if my body had been pulled out of a deep sleep. The first thing I noticed was the strange, heavy silence, almost as if there was a muffled buzz filling the entire room. I was lying on my side, looking at the wall, and the feeling I had was that I was not alone. It was as if there was someone there with me, standing watching. My heart started to speed up before I even turned around to check. When I finally got the courage to turn my head towards the room, my eyes went straight to the corner near the door. That's when I saw it. A dark figure, tall, standing there, completely motionless. I couldn't distinguish face, clothes, nothing. Just a dense shadow, cut out of the rest of the darkness of the room. I froze. For a few seconds I stared at that without even blinking, and the only thing that went through my mind was, there's someone in here. I blinked a few times, trying to understand if my eyes weren't playing tricks. At the third blink, the shadow was simply no longer there. The corner seemed empty, as it always was, but the whole room looked different. The air got cold in an almost suffocating way, as if someone had opened a window that I knew was closed. I covered myself up to my chin, feeling my whole body shiver, but I couldn't take my eyes off that corner. With each passing second, the feeling of being observed only increased. I tried to convince myself that I had dreamed, that it was just my mind waking up confused in the middle of the night. But then I realized that I couldn't even hear the normal noise of the house anymore. No wind beating outside, nothing from the refrigerator motor in the kitchen. It was as if all the sounds had been swallowed by that room, and only that suffocating silence remained. Lying down, I tried to move to pick up the cell phone on the bedside table, but my arm seemed to weigh twice as much. I managed to reach out and turn on the screen, and the weak blue light illuminated part of the room. There was nothing there, just my normal things, but that didn't reassure me. On the contrary, it seemed that the light had made the environment even stranger, as if something was hiding just out of her reach. The clock showed 3:17 in the morning, and I had the feeling that time was dragging on purpose. So I decided to turn on the lamp light, just to make sure there was no one in the room. When the yellow light filled the space, I felt an immediate relief, but it didn't last long. I swear I saw, for a fraction of a second, a rapid movement in the reflection of the mirror that is on the opposite wall. It wasn't clear at all, just something dark passing by. I stuck it again. The mirror reflected my room normally, but that quick image didn't leave my head, and I couldn't take my eyes off him anymore. I didn't want to believe what I had seen, but at the same time my body reacted as if it were real. The heart shot, the breath short, and the eyes watered from so much effort not to blink. The room seemed smaller and smaller, as if the walls were closing in me. I even thought about getting up and running out of there, but something inside me said that if I moved, I would come across that again. So I stood still, sweating cold, with the lamp on, staring at every corner of the room as if my life depended on it. Time didn't make sense. It seemed that I had already been there for hours, but the clock was still ticking shortly after 3. At a certain moment, I began to hear a low, almost imperceptible creaking, coming exactly from the direction of the corner where I had seen the shadow for the first time. It was like the noise of wood being pressed, as if someone was leaning on the floor. My chest frosted. I knew it wasn't the kind of sound the house normally made, and it seemed to happen at regular intervals, as if it were intentional. At this point, I no longer knew if I was going crazy, or if there was really something there with me. The noise suddenly stopped, and it terrified me even more. I was completely motionless, trying to hear any other sound, but there was only that heavy silence. It was then that I noticed that the lamp of the lamp began to flash slightly, as if it were failing. Every time the light oscillated, my stomach turned, because I had the impression of seeing a shadow projected on the walls, but that did not correspond to anything in the room. When the light stabilized, the corner was empty, but the feeling was that someone was closer, much closer. I felt a chill run down the back of my neck, and the absurd certainty that if I looked at the side of the bed, someone would be there watching me. The fear was so great that I closed my eyes tightly and forced myself not to look, as if ignoring was the only way to survive. I was like this for a while that seemed endless, repeating to myself that it was just my mind playing a trick on me. At some point, I ended up opening my eyes again, and this time I didn't have the courage to turn my head. I just looked forward at the wall, trying to breathe slowly and not make any sudden movements. That's when I realized that the mattress sank slightly on my side, as if someone had been sitting there. I completely froze. The pressure was real. I felt the weight close to my leg, but I couldn't look. The air seemed stuck in my throat, and I only thought about screaming, but the voice just didn't come out. After a few seconds that seemed like hours, the pressure disappeared. The mattress returned to normal, and for some reason the light of the lamp went out by itself. I was in the dark, paralyzed, listening only to the sound of my heart hammering in my chest. I had never felt so much panic in my life. When I finally gathered the courage to reach the switch and turn on the light again, there was nothing. Just me, the room exactly as it always was, but with a cold that seemed to come from inside the walls. I couldn't sleep anymore after that. I sat on the bed, hugging my knees and looking at every corner, waiting for something to move again. The clock didn't seem to leave the place. Every minute took forever. I tried to rationalize, to think it was fatigue, stress, anything, but deep down I knew it wasn't. What really terrified me was remembering the feeling of someone sitting next to me. You couldn't invent that, you couldn't confuse it with a dream. When the sky began to clear and the first sunlight entered through the window, it was as if everything had evaporated. The room seemed normal, quiet, with nothing out of place. But the feeling didn't go away. All day I felt that weight with me, as if I had brought something from that dawn. To this day I can't explain what I saw or felt. I just know that I could never sleep with the door closed or in total darkness. It's been a few years since this happened, but I still remember that dawn as if it were yesterday. I never saw that shadow again, but the feeling that something was with me never totally disappeared. Whenever I wake up in the middle of the night, my first instinct is to look at that same corner of the room. It's automatic, as if I expected to see the figure there again, motionless, watching me. It's a fear that doesn't disappear, and that seems to have stuck in my memory in a way impossible to erase. To this day I don't know if that was real, the result of my mind, or something that simply has no explanation. But I know that, of all the things I've ever experienced, nothing compares to the terror of that night. If you've already woken up and felt like you weren't alone in the room, maybe you know what I'm talking about. And if you haven't been through this yet, I just hope you never need it. Have you ever had any experience like this, of feeling that there was someone in your room at dawn? I was 17 years old when this happened, and to this day I can't explain it in a way that makes sense to myself. My parents have always liked old houses, and the one we lived in at that time was more than 100 years old. The floor creaked in practically every room, the doors closed by themselves with the air current, so I grew up listening to strange noises. But that year, everything began to change. I almost always woke up at the same time, around 3:30 in the morning, with the feeling that someone was in my room. At first, I thought it was something in my head, because I already had this light sleep. But I soon realized it wasn't imagination. Every time I opened my eyes, there was a shadow stopped at the door. It wasn't like seeing only the darkness, it was a defined, tall, motionless form. I kept looking, paralyzed, unable to move. And the most disturbing thing is that, when it blinked, the shadow was still there. This was repeated so many times that I started to feel afraid of sleeping. There was a particular night that was scheduled. I woke up at the same time as always, but this time I didn't just see the shadow. Before the door moved, I heard someone calling me by name, in a very clear whisper. It was my mother's voice, just like the same intonation she used when she wanted to wake me up early to go to school. For a second, I almost answered, but something stopped me, because I knew she was sleeping in her room downstairs. The door then began to open slowly, creaking as it always did when someone passed by. I held my breath, my heart beating hard in my chest. I waited for my mother to show up, but no one came in. Just that still shadow, motionless, filling the door sling. I kept looking, motionless, and it was the first time I realized that no matter how much I blinked or rubbed my eyes, it was still there. The next morning, I even tried to comment with my mother, but she laughed and said that I was probably daydreaming. This made me even more confused, because I was sure of what I heard. It wasn't a distant or muffled sound, it was exactly her voice calling my name, as if she were right at the door. After that day, I started to avoid sleeping with the door completely closed, but it only seemed to get worse. The shadow didn't go away, and now it looked bolder, getting sharper and sharper. A few nights later, it happened again, only more intense. I was lying down, trying to ignore the anxiety, when I heard the same voice. Emily, very quietly repeating twice. But this time, along with the voice, the air in the room became heavy, as if it were difficult to breathe. The door opened a little more, and I clearly saw the dark silhouette occupying almost the entire entrance. I couldn't move, I just squeezed the sheets, waiting for it to pass. At that moment, I seriously thought about shouting for my parents, but it seemed that my throat didn't work. It was as if something had completely paralyzed me. The shadow stood there for a while that seemed endless, without taking any step, without emitting any sound beyond that voice that still echoed in my head. I felt my eyes watering with fear, because I knew it wasn't a dream. The feeling was too real. When I finally managed to move my fingers, I reached out to my cell phone and turned on the flashlight. As soon as the light illuminated the door, the shadow disappeared instantly. The door was really open, it wasn't imagination. I kept looking at the empty corridor, not having the courage to get out of bed. The silence returned, but the air was still heavy, as if something had left a trail. I spent the rest of the night awake, not daring to close my eyes again. After that night, I started to avoid telling anyone, because no one seemed to believe me. My friends thought it was just school stress, and my parents said I was watching too many things on TV. But I knew it wasn't that. It was always the same time, always the same corner of the door, and that voice identical to my mother's. I started to go to bed already with my cell phone in my hand, as if the light was the only protection I had. The worst thing was when, one morning, I heard my name again, but this time it wasn't a whisper. It was louder, almost as if someone had spoken inside the room. I jumped out of bed with my heart racing, pointed the flashlight in all directions, but I didn't see anything. The door was just ajar, and behind it the dark corridor seemed even deeper. I stood in the middle of the room, not knowing if I ran to my parents or if I stayed there locked until dawn. I ended up choosing not to leave the room, because the idea of crossing the dark corridor made me even more terrified. I locked the door and pushed a chair against it, even knowing that it wouldn't make much difference if there really was someone there. I lay down again, but I had the flashlight on and my eyes fixed on the door. Each pop of the houses would seem like a step, and with each shadow cast by the trees outside, I felt my heart jump in my chest. When it finally dawned, I ran downstairs to meet my mother in the kitchen. I asked her if she had gone up to my room during the night, and she said no. She said she had slept all night. I didn't tell about the voice in detail at that moment, because I knew she would think it was imagination. But inside me, the certainty was absolute. That thing knew how to imitate my mother's voice, and seemed to be using it to attract me. After that day, I could never sleep peacefully in that house. I kept listening to footsteps in the hallway for weeks, and still woke up at the same time, but the shadow never appeared in the same way again. Even so, the fear stayed with me. I avoided looking at the door at night. I always slept with a light on, and started to leave low music playing to stifle the silence. None of this erased what had already happened, the memory of the voice that was not my mother's, but that sounded exactly like her. Today, years later, I still find myself thinking about it. No matter how much I try to rationalize, I never found an explanation. All I know is that the voice called me in such a real way that, for a moment, I almost obeyed and answered. And this is the part that scares me the most. What would have happened if I had followed that voice? Have you ever been through something like this? To hear someone from the family calling for you in the middle of the night when you knew it couldn't be real. I remember that night well because I was alone at home, something that didn't make me feel very comfortable anymore. My parents had traveled, and I was responsible for taking care of the house for a few days. It was just after midnight, and I was in the living room watching TV, trying not to think about the fact that the whole house was silent beyond that sound. That's when, out of nowhere, I heard a huge rumble coming from upstairs, as if a closet had plummeted on the floor. The noise was so loud that I almost jumped off the couch. My first instinct was to run out, but I ended up getting stuck, trying to convince myself that it had only been something falling. I took a deep breath, took my cell phone to use the flashlight, and climbed the stairs slowly, each step creaking under my feet. When I got to the upstairs hallway, the silence was so absolute that I even doubted I had really heard something. Everything was in place, as if nothing had happened. I first entered my parents' room, which was right at the end of the corridor. The bed was made, the wardrobe closed, nothing out of place. Then I went to my room, turned on the light, and didn't see anything strange either. What bothered me was that the noise had been too loud to simply not have left any sign. It seemed impossible that something so strong had happened without moving at least one object. I began to open each door slowly, looking at the bathroom, the guest room, even the small office that was facing the stairs. Everything was intact, exactly as my parents had left before traveling. But the silence was heavy, different from normal, as if the whole house had been paused. I felt my heart racing and a huge desire to run down, but at the same time something made me stay there, looking for an explanation. So I decided to go back to the hallway and stand still for a few seconds, trying to hear anything. That's when I noticed something strange. There was no sound, not even that of the street outside. No wind, no passing cars, nothing. It was as if the whole environment had suddenly been muffled. This absolute silence only made what I had heard even more real in my head, as if it had happened in another dimension, but inside my house. I decided to check the attic, even though I don't like the idea. The entrance was just above the corridor, with that retractable staircase. I took courage, pulled the rope, and climbed a few steps, illuminating with the cell phone flashlight. The place was dusty, with old boxes stacked, and nothing seemed to have moved. Still, the feeling that there was something up there with me was suffocating. Every second, I felt like I shouldn't be looking at that space. I closed access to the attic as fast as I could, and went back to the hallway, trying to convince myself that I was exaggerating. Still, I couldn't get rid of the memory of the roar. It was as if the house had screamed inside, and now pretended that nothing had happened. I went back down to the living room, but each step on the stairs seemed to echo more than usual, as if someone was following me closely. Back on the couch, I turned off the TV to pay attention to any noise, but I regretted it at the time. The silence was absolute, and that was even worse. My eyes swept the whole room, waiting for something to move. I even thought about calling a friend and staying on the phone until dawn, but I didn't have the courage to tell him what I had heard. I just stood there, motionless, with the feeling that upstairs was still hiding something I hadn't seen. More than an hour passed, and nothing happened. I was almost convinced that I had imagined everything, when the same thud echoed again, exactly like the first one. This time, it was so strong that the lamps in the room even trembled. My whole body froze, and I knew I wouldn't have the courage to go up again. I ran to the front door and stood still, with my hand on the doorknob, seriously thinking about going out and waiting outside until dawn. In the end, I didn't leave. I leaned against the door, trying to control my breathing, while staring at the dark staircase. The noise was not repeated, but the tension was almost unbearable. The clock marked every minute until the sun rose, and I didn't close my eyes even for a moment. When it finally dawned, I went up again, and once again I found everything exactly in place. No fallen furniture, no unusual object. Just a strange silence, as if the house kept a secret that would never reveal to me. To this day I can't explain what happened that night. I never heard that kind of roar inside the house again, but I also never managed to forget the sound. It was too high, too real, as if something huge had plummeted upstairs. The most disturbing was the absence of any signal. Nothing out of place, nothing broken. I got the feeling that, if I had gone up again during the night, I would have found something I didn't want to see. Whenever I remember this, I feel the same chill I felt that morning. I've heard people saying that old houses make noises, that the wood squeaks, but those who have witnessed it know that it's not the same thing. That wasn't a crash, it was an impact. And to this day I wonder what really happened upstairs. And you, have you ever been through something like this, hearing a noise impossible to ignore, but without finding any explanation afterwards? That night I woke up suddenly, for no apparent reason. I looked at the clock, and it was exactly 2 a.m. At first I thought it was just one more of those times when we wake up in the middle of the night without explanation, but then I clearly heard my name being whispered in the hallway. It wasn't just any noise or my imagination. It was sharp, low, but close enough to freeze me completely. My heart raced, and before I could convince myself to ignore, the bedroom door began to open slowly. The creaking of the wood echoed in the silence of the house, and I was paralyzed, staring at that dark span that was gradually increasing. There was no one on the other side, only the empty and silent corridor, but the feeling of being watched was unbearable, as if someone was standing there, out of my field of vision. I was lying down without being able to move a muscle, just watching the door open by itself until it stopped halfway. The corridor was still empty, but I didn't have the courage to get up to close. It was as if the darkness outside had weight, and every second I felt that something was about to cross the door. I spent the rest of the night motionless, holding my breath and with my eyes fixed in that dark space. When it finally dawned, I went down to the exhausted kitchen and tried to convince myself that I had dreamed. But the sense of reality was very strong. It was only the next day, when my father commented that the internal security camera had recorded something strange, that my stomach sank. I ran up to check, and when I reviewed the images of that night, at 1:59 a.m., I perfectly saw a shadow standing on my door frame, exactly at the point where I heard the whisper minutes later. I watched the video several times, trying to find a logical explanation. I thought maybe it was some problem with the camera, a recording failure, but it didn't seem like it. The shadow was there, standing still, with a high and defined contour, occupying all the space of the door. The most disturbing thing was that she didn't move at any time. He stood still for a few seconds and then simply disappeared, as if he had dissolved in the air. I showed it to my mother, but she said it should be a reflection or some light trick. But I knew it wasn't. I was there, heard my name being called, and saw the door open by itself. The video only confirmed that something really happened. I spent the rest of the day with that feeling stuck to me, as if someone was still watching me inside the house, waiting for me to be alone again. The next night, I tried to sleep with the door locked, but it didn't bring any relief. With each snap of the house, I held my breath, afraid of hearing my name again. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up scared, sweaty, but this time I didn't hear anything. Still, I couldn't go back to sleep. I stared at the door, waiting for the doorknob to move by itself, and with the cell phone in my hand to, if necessary, film anything. When it dawned, I went to check the camera again, almost like a ritual. Reviewing the images, I saw that at 1:59 a.m. the same shadow appeared again. I was at the same point, motionless, only this time it seemed a little closer to the door. My stomach turned at the time. No matter what I did, lock the door or leave the light on, that thing always came back at the same time, as if I were fulfilling a routine. I didn't have the courage to tell anyone else after that, because I was already tired of hearing that it was imagination or reflex. So I kept it to myself and started to write down each occurrence, always at the same time, always at the same point. What scared me the most was remembering the whisper of the first night, calling my name. If that shadow could imitate a voice, what else could it do? This question kept hammering in my head. The following nights, I tried to sleep in the living room, but even there I didn't feel safe. The whole house seemed taken over by that presence, as if it was impossible to escape. The upstairs corridor, in particular, was marked for me. Just passing by it during the day, I remembered the shadow standing on the stop, motionless, as if I were still waiting. It was the first time in my life that I really thought about moving, even living with my parents. After a few weeks, the shadow stopped appearing in the recordings, but the sensation never left. To this day, whenever I wake up at dawn, the first thing I do is look at the bedroom door. Part of me expects to see that same dense, motionless darkness occupying the stop. I never heard the whisper calling my name again, but that doesn't mean I feel calm. It looks more like a pause than an end. No matter how much I try to forget, I still feel watched inside that house. I've heard stories of people who see similar things in corridors or doors, but only those who pass by know the real fear of living this. To this day, I don't know what that shadow was, nor why it seemed to call me. And you, have you ever looked at a security camera and seen something that shouldn't be there? I woke up in the middle of the night with my dog barking in a way I had never seen before. He wasn't just agitated, it was an aggressive, continuous bark, as if he was trying to expel something from the backyard. I looked at the clock, and it was just after 3 in the morning. Still a little sleepy, I got up and realized that the lights with motion sensor had turned on outside, illuminating part of the lawn. At the time, my heart already accelerated, because those lights only turn on when something moves in the backyard. I approached the living room window and pulled the curtain carefully. The dog was standing near the glass door, growling low, his whole body goosebumps. That's when I looked at the lawn and noticed the marks, wet footprints, starting near the fence and going straight until they stop exactly under the balcony, just below where I was. The footprints were too sharp to be of any animal. They were big marks, with bare feet, as if someone had crossed the wet backyard during the night. I stood there, trying to find a logical explanation, but nothing made sense. The fence was high, difficult to climb, and it was also locked. How could someone have passed by there without making noise? Even more so with my dog loose in the backyard. While I was watching, I realized that the sensor lights were still on, as if there was still movement outside. But I didn't see anyone. The dog barking louder and louder, staring at the same spot under the balcony. I felt a chill run down my back because I had the impression that there was something there, standing still, just out of the reach of the light. I took my cell phone and used the flashlight to try to illuminate better, but it didn't help much. The light only reinforced the footprints, which seemed even fresher, as if they had been made seconds before. I couldn't see anything beyond that, no movement, no sign of someone hiding. Still, my dog didn't unglue his eyes from that point, growling nonstop, as if he could see what I couldn't. I thought about going out to check, but the idea of opening the door and coming across whatever it was left me frozen. Instead, I stood at the window, trying to hear anything other than the bars. For a few moments, everything was in absolute silence. The lights suddenly went out, as if the sensor had stopped detecting movement. But the footprints were still there, wet, reflecting the little light that came from the street. I waited a few minutes before building courage and unlocking the glass door. My dog ran out in front, sniffing the lawn as if he was following an invisible trail. I lit up the floor with the cell phone flashlight and saw that the footprints were stopping exactly under the balcony. There were no signs of return, no indication that someone had gone elsewhere. It was as if the person had simply stopped there and disappeared. The silence of the backyard was suffocating, broken only by my dog's desperate nose. I pointed the flashlight everywhere, hoping to find something obvious that would explain those marks, but there was nothing. The intact fence, the closed gate, no strange movement. Just those wet footprints, standing under the balcony, as if someone had been watching the house in the middle of the night. I went back inside quickly, locking the door and closing all the curtains. My dog was restless all night, walking from one side to the other, always stopping in front of the glass door and growling low. I couldn't sleep anymore. I was just lying on the couch with my cell phone in my hand, waiting for the backyard lights to turn on again. But nothing happened until dawn. When the sun finally came out, I went outside to check again. The footprints were still there, now dry, but perfectly visible on the crushed grass. I followed the trail with my eyes to the fence, trying to find some sign of entry, but there was nothing. No holes, no loose spots. It was impossible for someone to have jumped without leaving marks. That's when I realized that the footprints didn't come from outside to inside, but started exactly on the fence line, as if someone had appeared there out of nowhere. That was the last night I was alone in the house without turning on all the outside lights. Even so, I never felt completely safe after seeing those marks. No matter how many times I try to explain to myself, I can't understand how wet footprints appeared out of nowhere, crossed the backyard and stopped exactly under the balcony, as if someone had stood there watching me sleep. To this day, when I look at that lawn at night, I have the feeling that something can still come back. What scares me the most is thinking that my dog saw or felt something that I couldn't see. Because if he reacted that way, it's because there was someone or something really there. And you, have you ever seen strange marks in the backyard or in your house that had no explanation? It was winter, and the house was completely silent that night. I was already lying down, but I couldn't sleep because of the wind hitting the windows. It was then that I heard a sound that gave me goosebumps at the time. Slow, heavy steps climbing the steps of the front balcony. The sound was unmistakable, each pop of the wood echoing by the silence of the dawn. At first I thought it was some neighbor or even a mistake, but my heart accelerated in a strange way, as if my body already knew that something was not right. I got up slowly, went to the living room, and pulled the curtain from the window that faced the balcony. That's when I saw a man standing right in front of the door, wearing a heavy coat and a hood that covered his entire face. He didn't nod, he was just there, motionless, looking at the entrance of my house. I was paralyzed behind the curtain, trying not to make any sudden movements. The distance between us was minimal, only the glass and the wooden door separated my room from that man. He didn't knock, didn't try to open the door, he just stood there in absolute silence. The cold of the night seemed to have entered with him, because suddenly the air in the room became cold, difficult to breathe. After a few seconds that seemed like minutes, he finally turned around. He went down the steps of the balcony with the same calm with which he had climbed, and walked down the dark street until he disappeared. I stood still, watching until I completely lost his silhouette. Even so, I couldn't get out of the window. I was sure that if I blinked or turned his back, he would come back and be there again, standing by the door. I couldn't sleep the rest of the night. I kept walking around the house, checking if all the doors and windows were well locked, even though I already knew they were. With each pop of the wood or blow of wind, I was scared thinking he had returned. The strangest thing was that it didn't make sense for anyone to go up to my balcony, stand still looking at the door, and simply leave without saying anything. The next morning, I went down to check better. The balcony steps had fresh mud marks, exactly where he was standing. They were brands of large boots, which contrasted with the light wood. There were no footprints coming back, just going down to the sidewalk and disappearing right ahead. I stood there for a few minutes, looking at those marks, trying to understand if it had really been real or some kind of hallucination caused by fear. I told my parents what had happened, but they thought it could just be someone lost, maybe a neighbor coming back from some bar. The way he stood still, motionless, doing nothing but watching, left me with a feeling that no logical excuse could erase. It wasn't normal behavior. It was as if he had gone up to my door just to let me know he was there. The next night, I was lying down waiting for any noise on the balcony. Every creaking of the house left me on alert, ready to run to the window. But nothing happened. Even so, the fear didn't go away. I even avoided opening the curtains after dark, afraid of coming across that stopped hood again, waiting patiently in front of my house. A few days later, I still couldn't stop thinking about that scene. It was as if the image of him standing on the balcony had been engraved in my mind, repeating in a loop every time I passed near the door. What scared me the most was the silence. If he had hit or said something, maybe it would make more sense. But the fact that I just stood there, motionless, looking inside, made everything much more disturbing. I started to notice any strange movement on the street, but I never saw anyone like it again. Still, every time I passed by the balcony, I felt as if I had left an invisible mark, a trail of presence that did not go away. Winter followed, but every cold night I remembered the sound of the steps slowly climbing the steps, echoing exactly the way I heard that night. Even after weeks, I still avoided sleeping early. He was always in the living room, with the TV on, trying to ignore any noise coming from the street. But nothing ever happened again. It was as if that night had been unique, enough to never leave me alone again. To this day, whenever I hear footsteps on wooden stairs, my heart races, and the first image that comes to my mind is his, standing in the dark, without showing his face. I never found out who that man was, nor why he chose to stop on my balcony. Maybe it was just someone passing through, maybe not. But to this day, every time I pull the curtain, I feel the fear of seeing that hood again motionless in front of the door. And you, have you ever witnessed a strange person standing outside your house in the middle of the night? That Friday I got home earlier than my friends, something rare to happen. They had gone out to a party, and I wasn't in the mood, so I was alone. I spent the night playing in the room, and then went to bed, but sleep took a long time to come. It was just after midnight when I heard the first noises coming from the kitchen. At first I thought it was something in my head, but the sound was too clear, cutlery hitting, closet doors opening and closing. My room was upstairs, and I could hear each clap echoing, as if someone was really messing with everything downstairs. My first reaction was to think that my friends had arrived earlier, but I didn't hear the front door being opened. I got up with my heart racing, went down the stairs slowly, and prepared to run into someone. But when I got to the kitchen, the place was empty. Only one of the open cabinets and a broken glass on the floor, as if it had fallen seconds before. I stood there, trying to understand what I had just seen. The closet was heavy, one of those that don't open by themselves, and I was sure it had closed it much earlier. The broken glass was in pieces near the sink, and the detail that bothered me the most was that it was inside the closet before. It didn't make any sense to be on the ground, even more so like that. The silence in the kitchen was so strong that I could almost hear my heart beating. I decided to take the broom to gather the shards, but I confessed that my hands were shaking. With every movement, I looked around as if someone was going to appear at any moment. As soon as I finished, I closed the closet and went back to the room, trying to convince myself that I had imagined the noises. But deep down I knew it wasn't something in my head, because the sounds had really woken me up and I had seen the result there on the floor. I lay in bed again, but I couldn't relax. I kept looking at the ceiling, expecting to hear another noise at any moment. And it didn't take long. About 20 minutes later, I heard again the same sound of closet doors opening, followed by the metallic noise of cutlery hitting each other. This time my whole body got goosebumps. I knew it wasn't a coincidence, it couldn't be the wind or anything like that. I took my cell phone and thought about sending a message for my friends to come back soon, but I thought they were going to laugh at my face. So I went down again, only more slowly, trying to be as quiet as possible. When I reached the middle of the stairs, I realized that the kitchen lights were off, but the sounds continued. It was as if someone was fiddling with the drawers and cabinets in the dark. I stood in the middle of the stairs, not in the courage to take another step. The noises were clear, they came exactly from the kitchen, but there was no light on. I got up the courage and put on the cell phone flashlight before entering. As soon as I lit up the environment, everything stopped. The silence was immediate, as if someone had frozen when they realized that I was there. I looked around, and once again there was no one. Just the same gaping closet, the same as before, as if it had been opened on purpose. At this point, I no longer knew if I was in shock or angry at not understanding what was happening. I closed the closet tightly, locked the kitchen door, and went back upstairs almost running. I locked the door to my room and sat on the bed, in total silence, trying to hear any sign that the sounds would return. For long minutes nothing happened, until I heard a last dry clap coming from below, as if someone had hit their palm against the wood of the table. The sound was so clear that I almost dropped the cell phone from my hand. I was paralyzed, not knowing if I was going down again or pretending that nothing had happened. In the end, I stood there motionless, staring at the door of my room, as if at some point it would open by itself. I was sweating cold, short of breath, waiting for any sign of movement in the corridor. But after that snap, everything became completely silent again. I spent the rest of the night without sleeping, just waiting for my friends to arrive. When they finally entered the house, around 4 a.m, I ran down to meet them. I told them what had happened, but they didn't believe it. They laughed, saying that I was probably too tired and ended up being scared by normal noises in the house. I even tried to agree, but deep down I knew it wasn't that, mainly because no glass would break alone inside a closed closet. The next morning, when I woke up, I went down to have breakfast and found the same open closet again. I was absolutely sure that I had closed it before going to sleep, and no one else met with it. I stood still for a few minutes just staring at that, feeling the same strange sensation from the night before. It was at that moment that I realized that I would never be able to be alone in that house without remembering the noises and the kitchen in the dark. To this day, when I tell this story, no one really believes it. But I know what I heard, and I know what I saw. Nothing explains that broken glass, the cutlery moving, and the always open closet, as if someone wanted to leave a clear sign that they were there. And you, have you ever heard noises coming from the kitchen in the middle of the night, and were you sure you weren't alone? That night I was alone at home, putting on some clothes to wash before going to sleep. The laundry was at the back of the house, near the door that led straight to the backyard. I was absolutely sure that I had locked it earlier, as I always did when it got dark. But while I was moving the machine, I heard a click coming from behind me. When I looked, I realized that the lock was open. I stood still for a few seconds, not understanding. My heart started racing, because it didn't make any sense. I had turned the key myself hours before. The door was closed, but the latch was loose, as if someone had moved it on the outside. I didn't have the courage to open it to check. I just stopped again and took a deep breath, trying to convince myself that maybe I had forgotten. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that. I went back to the machine trying to ignore it, but every second it got harder. The silence of the laundry was heavy, and I felt as if someone was standing on the other side of the door waiting. A few minutes later, I clearly heard the handle start to turn, slowly, as if someone was testing the lock. At the time, my legs locked, and I could only stare at the door, watching the metal move by itself. The feeling was horrible, as if someone was trying to get into my house at that very moment. I ran to the kitchen and took my cell phone, but I couldn't call anyone. I just stood still with the screen in my hand, listening to the sound of the doorknob insisting once again. Then suddenly it stopped. The silence returned, and it seemed even scarier than the noise. I didn't have the courage to get close again. I locked the door that gave access to the kitchen, and kept walking from one side to the other, trying to decide what to do. I looked at the clock every minute, as if waiting for dawn was the only way out. The problem is that every noise in the house made me jump, and I was sure that if I got close to the laundry, I would hear the doorknob turning again. After a time that seemed like an eternity, I heard a dry snap, as if the door had slammed by itself. I didn't have the courage to check at the time, but my heart almost came out of my mouth. I could only think that if there really was someone out there, that person was testing all the ways to get in. And the worst part was knowing that the laundry was in the back, away from the street, where no one could see anything happening. I stayed in the living room, with the light on, listening carefully to every sound in the house. Around 2 in the morning, when I finally began to calm down, the silence was broken again. Another metallic click, as if the lock had been moved once again. My whole body frosted. I had not only closed the laundry door, but also the kitchen door, and it still seemed that someone was trying to pass by. The feeling was that, at any moment, the door would open. I squeezed my cell phone in my hands and thought about calling the police, but I felt ridiculous without having anything concrete to show. So I stood still on alert, watching the corridor that led to the kitchen. Nothing happened after that last click, but the tension was unbearable. I stayed there until the sun began to rise, without closing my eyes even for a second. When it finally dawned, I gathered the courage to go to the laundry. The door was closed, but the lock was loose again, as if it had been unlocked overnight. The detail that made me more nervous was seeing the mark of the handle on the wood, as if it had been turned hard several times. At that moment I was sure it wasn't something in my head. Someone really tried to get in. I spent the rest of the day on alert, jumping at every noise in the house. I locked all the doors and even pushed a piece of furniture against the laundry one when it got dark again. But the feeling of insecurity never passed. I knew that if I had opened the door by the time I heard the click or the doorknob moving, I could have come across someone there, hiding in the dark of the backyard. I could never use the laundry at night after that day. To this day, when I remember the sound of the lock unlocking by itself and the doorknob moving, I feel the same chill running down my back. I don't know if it was someone trying to get in or something that just can't be explained, but that door has become a point of fear in the house. I avoided even passing by when I was alone. Over time, I learned not to question too much. The lock was changed, but the feeling never went away. Whenever I'm alone at home and hear any metallic click, the memory comes back as if it were yesterday. And have you ever heard a door moving by itself at dawn, and you didn't have the courage to open it to see what was on the other side? I never really liked that house I rented, especially because of the attic. It was one of those accessed only by a retractable ladder, which creaked high every time someone pulled it. I had never gone up there at any time, precisely because it gave me a certain discomfort. So when I came back from work on a rainy night and looked at the roof, I felt my stomach sink. The small attic window was open. I stopped on the sidewalk for a few seconds, trying to convince myself that maybe I had left it like that without realizing it, but it was impossible. I never moved that part of the house. When I entered, everything seemed normal, but there was a detail that made me even more nervous. A strong smell of wet earth, coming exactly from the top direction. It was as if the entire air in the corridor was carried by that odor, forcing me to face the ceiling and think about what could be happening up there. I climbed the main stairs slowly, with my heart beating fast, until I reached the point of the ceiling where the retractable ladder to the attic was. I stood still looking at her, without the courage to pull, while the smell of earth seemed to get more and more intense. There was no sound coming from above, but the feeling that something was there was so strong that it seemed almost palpable. I took a deep breath, held on tight, and pulled the ladder. The noise echoed throughout the house, as if I had just woken someone up. With my cell phone in hand and the flashlight on, I climbed the first steps and lit up the space. It was dusty, full of old boxes and spider webs, but nothing seemed out of place. Still, the smell was suffocating, almost impossible to ignore. I walked a little through the attic, pointing the flashlight to each corner, hoping to find some animal that could have entered through the window. But there was nothing, no trace, not even marks in the dust of the floor. I closed the window and stood there for a few seconds, trying to understand how she had opened herself. The lock was intact, it didn't seem forced. The silence in the attic was absolute, but the smell of wet earth seemed impregnated in the walls, as if it had come from inside the wood itself. The detail that made me goosebumps was to realize that, even walking around, my own footprints were clear in the dust, and there was no other besides mine. I went down quickly, pulled the ladder back, and locked the access. I spent the rest of the night walking around the house, unable to relax. Every time I looked at the ceiling, I felt like something was above me, standing still, just waiting. The smell was still weak down the corridor, and it seemed impossible to escape from that. I knew that, somehow, whatever had opened the window was still nearby. The next morning I left for work early, but I couldn't help but look at the roof before getting in the car. The attic window was closed, just as I had left it the night before. Still, during the whole day, the memory of that smell didn't leave my head. It was so specific, so strong, that I felt like it had stuck to me. When I came home at night, the first thing I did was look up. The window was still closed, but the feeling of being observed from some high point was suffocating. I decided to go up again, against all my will, just to make sure nothing had changed. Once again, the attic was empty. Nothing out of place, no sign that someone or something had been there. But the smell persisted, and while illuminating the farthest corner, I swear I had the impression of seeing the dust on the floor moving by itself, as if someone had just passed by their seconds before. I went down so fast that I almost fell down the stairs, pulling it back and hitting the lid hard. My heart was racing, and I felt ridiculous for not having seen anything concrete, but the fear was real. I locked all the doors, closed the windows, and tried to watch TV to distract my mind, but with each pop of the house my gaze turned to the ceiling, imagining slow steps above me. That night seemed endless, as if the hours didn't pass. When it finally dawned, I decided to inspect the outside of the house. I walked to the side, looking at the roof, and froze. The window was open again. I knew I had closed it with my own hands the night before. It didn't make any sense. I looked around looking for marks on the floor, but there was only wet earth scattered near the wall, as if someone had climbed there. The smell, somehow, was also outside. After that day, I could never face that house the same way again. I avoided even looking at the attic, because every time I passed through the corridor, I had the impression of smelling the same smell of wet earth coming from up there. I never found an explanation for the window opening by itself, much less for the fact that it is always unlocked when I swore I had closed it. It was as if something insisted on making that space accessible. To this day, I don't know what really happened there. I never went up to the attic again, and honestly I prefer not to know what I could find if I decided to insist. But what creeps me the most is to think that, during those nights, maybe I wasn't alone in the house. And you, have you ever had the feeling that someone used a part of your house that you never frequented?